Burrard Inlet, the First Narrows, Vancouver, British Columbia. February 1938, 20 minutes before first light. Constable Walter Dunbar, Vancouver Police Department Marine Unit, 16 years on the harbor patrol, held the launch off the grain terminal and read the current running through the Narrows before he decided whether to cross it. He was not consulting a chart. The tide through the First Narrows reversed 4 times a day, and at this hour, on this date, in this month, he already knew which way it was running and how long the slack water would hold before it turned again. He was watching for something else, a set of running lights that had not shown up on schedule 3 nights running. On a boat he had a fair idea he could name without seeing it. Dispatch had not called about it. Dispatch had no reason to call about it. Nothing had happened yet. What Dunbar knew about which 2 piers were worth watching that particular night, on that particular tide, had not come from a harbor master's chart, a police manual, or a radio message. It had come from somewhere the department had never once written down, and it was the only thing standing between the grain terminal and whatever was moving through the dark water on that tide. Closing question. What did 16 years on the Marine Unit actually teach Constable Dunbar about the tide, the terminals, and a boat he had not yet laid eyes on? And where had that knowledge come from, if not from anything the department kept on paper? Before you can understand what Dunbar's knowledge was worth, you need to understand what actually watched Burrard Inlet in 1938. There was no single harbor patrol. The Vancouver Police Department had run a Marine Unit since 1911, chasing waterfront theft and smuggling with launches, and no radio contact once they left the dock. The British Columbia Provincial Police ran their own coastal patrol vessels, tied into one of the first fully integrated radio telegraph systems in North America, a genuinely advanced network of radio cars and coastal boats that the BCPP had built largely in its own workshops. And offshore, Federal National Revenue Preventive Service customs vessels, built for about half the speed of the rum-running boats they were chasing, patrolled against a smuggling trade that had made Vancouver one of the busiest bootlegging ports on the Pacific coast. 3 different institutions, 3 different radio systems, 3 different chains of command, covering the same water. None of them could see the whole inlet. None of their radios could tell Dunbar which boat was worth following at 4 in the morning. What the system could provide was speed once something was reported. What it could not provide was the knowledge of what to report in the first place. And that gap, on Burrard Inlet in February 1938, was covered by nothing but the officer on the water. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vessel, the posting, the territory knowledge that years on one stretch of water or road built in the officer who worked it in every season, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant in this era. Not Mountie mythology. The documented operational and human reality of policing a harbor whose geography required its officers to know it the way no single institution ever managed to. What 16 years on the Marine Unit gave Constable Dunbar about the tide through the First Narrows is something no harbor chart and no dispatch radio has ever been built to hold. And if you served with the Marine Unit, the BC Provincial Police Coastal Patrol, the National Harbors Board Police, or the RCMP on this water, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you or your family served in this era, what do you remember about which pier belonged to which force, and how you were expected to know it without being told twice? Next time, the National Revenue Preventive Service patrol vessel Preventor, and 6 years spent chasing boats it was never built to catch. Back on the water. Closing question. What did the vehicle and the institution actually provide Constable Dunbar on Burrard Inlet? And what did his own knowledge have to add to make any of it useful at 4 in the morning? The first and second Narrows were the 2 choke points of Burrard Inlet, and both reversed hard, 4 times a day, in patterns that a chart could describe in general terms and that only years on the water could describe specifically enough to be useful. A slackwater window at the first Narrows might last 11 minutes on one tide and 20 on the next, depending on the wind and the season. And a small boat running without lights had exactly that window to cross without leaving a wake that a patrol launch a mile off could read in the dark. Dunbar had learned this the way most Marine Unit officers learned it, by being on the water often enough, across enough winters and enough tides, that the pattern stopped being a fact he had memorized and became something closer to instinct. He also knew the terminals themselves in a way no organizational chart captured. Which grain elevator had a night watchman who slept through his rounds? Which coal pier had a loading gap in its schedule wide enough to hide an unrecorded transfer? Which captains on the regular lumber runs would answer a hail honestly, and which would not? None of this was written down anywhere the department kept records. It lived in the officers who worked the water long enough to accumulate it, and it left the harbor every time one of them did. Closing question. If none of this territory knowledge was ever recorded, what happened to it when an officer transferred, retired, or simply moved on? And what did the Marine Unit, the BCPP, and the Customs Patrol actually lose each time that happened? Before you can understand why a slackwater window at the first Narrows mattered enough for a constable to memorize it, you need to understand what British Columbia's Prohibition years actually did to Vancouver's harbor. Provincial Prohibition took effect in 1917. American Prohibition followed in 1920 and lasted until 1933. For most of that overlap, alcohol could legally leave a Canadian port bound for anywhere except the United States, a distinction that turned Vancouver into one of the busiest rum-running departure points on the Pacific coast. By 1929, an estimated 7,000 people in the city were understood to be involved in the bootlegging trade in some capacity. Motherships loaded offshore and smaller contact boats ran the actual crossing, and the same slackwater timing that let a boat avoid leaving a wake also let it avoid a patrol launch's running lights. The BC Provincial Police and the Federal Customs Patrol vessels, built, by design, for roughly half the speed of the boats they were chasing, could not outmotor the trade. They could only outknow it. Which coves along the inlet held a boat overnight? Which captains ran the same route on the same tide every few weeks? Which terminal gaps a smaller craft would use to slip through unremarked? That knowledge, again, belonged to the officers who worked the water, not to the vessels or the radios that were supposed to catch anyone. Closing question. If the patrol vessels themselves could never outrun the rum-running boats, what else, besides speed, did the BC Provincial Police and the Customs Patrol actually have working in their favor on Burrard Inlet through the 1920s? In 1936, the federal government dissolved the Vancouver Harbour Commissioners, which had administered the port's infrastructure since 1913, and folded Vancouver into the new National Harbours Board, a federal body that came with its own harbor police detachment. That gave Burrard Inlet a fourth layer of jurisdiction on top of the VPD Marine Unit, the BC Provincial Police Coastal Patrol, and the federal customs vessels already working the same water. The National Harbours Board Police answered to Ottawa and were paid from port revenues rather than government appropriations. Their beat was the port's own land and structures, the piers, the terminals, the warehouses, while the Marine Unit and the BCPP kept working the water around them. For an officer like Dunbar, this meant a second body of knowledge layered on top of the tides, which pier belonged to which force on paper, and which force actually showed up first in practice when something went wrong at 3 in the morning. No manual explained this cleanly, because the arrangement itself was not clean. It had grown, piece by piece, out of 4 different institutions, solving 4 different problems on the same 12 miles of shoreline, and the officer on the water was the one expected to hold the whole overlapping map in his head. Closing question. What did it actually mean, in practice, for 4 different police jurisdictions to share responsibility for the same stretch of working harbor? And who paid the cost when the overlap failed? Before you can understand what the Marine Unit and its knowledge actually meant to Vancouver's working waterfront, you need to understand what the same police forces also did on that waterfront. On 18 June 1935, roughly 1,000 striking longshoremen and their supporters marched toward Ballantine Pier, the same grain terminal Dunbar's patrol worked, to protest strikebreakers unloading ships during a bitter lockout by the Shipping Federation. They were met by a combined force of Vancouver Police, BC Provincial Police, and RCMP backup under Chief Constable W. Foster. Mounted officers charged the crowd. Tear gas was fired into a first aid station run by the Longshoremen's Women's Auxiliary, and at least 100 people were hospitalized in what one newspaper called the bloodiest hours in the waterfront's history. The strike itself failed that year, though it helped build the independent union that followed 2 years later. This channel does not soften that. The same institutional knowledge of Burrard Inlet's terminals and tides that protected commerce from smuggling and theft was, on that particular June afternoon, turned against the people who unloaded the ships those terminals depended on. Both things happened on the same harbor, inside the same institutions, often within the careers of the same officers. Closing question. What did the Battle of Ballantine Pier actually change? For the longshoremen, for the Shipping Federation, and for the relationship between Vancouver's harbor police and the people who worked the docks every day. Vancouver's harbor had already been the site of one of Canada's clearest acts of racial exclusion before this channel's period even opens. In 1914, VPD officers carried out a federally ordered deportation of the Komagata Maru, a ship carrying 376 British subjects from Punjab who were denied entry under immigration rules designed specifically to exclude South Asian migrants. Vancouver police continued surveilling the city's South Asian community for years afterward. That climate did not end in 1914. It shaped the harbor's immigration enforcement through the interwar decades this channel documents. And in December 1941, within days of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the federal government ordered every Japanese-Canadian fishing boat on the coast brought into port. Roughly 1,100 to 1,800 vessels were seized, chiefly by the Royal Canadian Navy's Fishermen's Reserve, under a wartime BC Security Council that included RCMP Assistant Commissioner Frederick Meade and BC Provincial Police Assistant Commissioner John Shiras. Documented RCMP and military assessments at the time found no evidence of sabotage or espionage, and some RCMP officials, Meade among them, are recorded as having pushed back against the harshest removal measures. The fishing fleet was sold off regardless. Burrard Inlet itself sits on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, whose relationship to this harbor long predates any of the institutions this script has named, and continued alongside them throughout the period. Closing question. What does it mean that the same harbor patrol structures built to protect commerce and catch smugglers were also, at different points in this exact period, instruments of a racially exclusionary immigration system and a wartime seizure that some of their own senior officers privately opposed? On 15 August 1950, at midnight, the British Columbia Provincial Police ceased to exist. 92 years of institutional history, including its coastal patrol vessels and one of the earliest fully integrated radio networks in North America, ended by provincial decision, over the strong objection of many of the municipalities the BCPP had served. 492 of its members transferred directly into the RCMP's new E Division, which has held the provincial policing contract in British Columbia ever since. On Burrard Inlet, this meant the coastal patrol role the BCPP had built up since the 1920s, the specific knowledge of which coves hid boats overnight, which captains could be trusted, which stretches of shoreline mattered on which tide, transferred, on paper, to officers who had not necessarily spent years accumulating it themselves. The RCMP inherited the BCPP's black and white patrol car livery, which the force kept and spread nationwide. It did not, and could not, inherit the specific title and terminal knowledge that had lived in individual BCPP officers, rather than in any file the province handed over. Even the veterans who made the transfer later said, on the record, that nobody in government ever adequately explained why the change had happened at all. Closing question. If the RCMP absorbed the BCPP's vessels, its radio system, and even the look of its patrol cars, what specifically could it not absorb, and what did Burrard Inlet lose the moment the transfer took effect? By 1968, Ottawa consolidated the National Harbours Board's separately administered port police forces, Vancouver's included, into a single national organization. Through the same years, the working harbor itself was changing underneath every institution that patrolled it. Containerization was beginning to replace the loose cargo terminals Dunbar's generation had known pier by pier, captain by captain, coal gap by grain elevator gap. Standardized boxes moving through automated terminals needed less of the specific human knowledge that had once been the only thing covering the space between a chart and a crime. What consolidation and containerization gave the institutions patrolling Burrard Inlet was efficiency, uniform command, and less duplicated effort across 4 overlapping jurisdictions. What it did not give the harbor was an officer who could read a slackwater window at the first Narrows without consulting a table, or who already knew, before any radio call came in, which 2 piers were worth watching that particular night. If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left, subscribe. There are more harbors, more grid roads, more northern detachments, more overlapping jurisdictions with 3 different radio systems covering the same water, and none of it was ever asked to write itself down. What 16 years on the Marine Unit gave Constable Dunbar about the tide through the first Narrows is something no harbor chart and no dispatch radio has ever been built to hold. And if you have a harbor, a patrol route, a posting, a detachment, put it in the comments. If you or your family served with the Marine Unit, the BC Provincial Police Coastal Patrol, the National Harbours Board Police, or the RCMP on this water, what do you remember about which pier belonged to which force, and how you were expected to know it without being told twice? Next time, the National Revenue Preventive Service patrol vessel Preventor, and 6 years spent chasing boats it was never built to catch. Constable Walter Dunbar's Marine Unit career, as this script has described it, closes sometime after the BCPP's absorption into the RCMP in 1950 and before the National Harbours Board Police consolidation of 1968. The exact years a composite officer of his type would have served are, like his name, illustrative rather than individually documented. What is documented is this: the tide through the first Narrows still reverses 4 times a day. The slackwater window still opens and closes on its own schedule, regardless of which force's radio is listening for it. The chart has not changed. The knowledge that once turned that chart into something useful at 4 in the morning belonged to specific officers, on specific boats, across 4 overlapping institutions that no single history, including this one, has ever fully reconciled. Nobody asked most of them what they knew before they moved on. The water does not know it lost anything. It just keeps running the way it always has. Back on the water.